Today we're talking to author Monica Boothe all about her series, The Gardener Kings. We're going to hear all about her books and we're going to get your questions answered down below. So make sure you are following along. And if you have questions, we'll be monitoring those over the next couple days and weeks. Monica, hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to be chatting with you today. This is our first time meeting and I want to know all about you as an author. So what do we need to know about you?
Ooh, well, I'm one of those writers who decided I wanted to be a writer when I was in preschool and just like wrote throughout my whole childhood. So it's kind of been a long time coming. I was an English teacher for a while, so I've always kind of stayed in the writing, reading kind of realm, but only recently have decided to take the plunge and quit my day job and just focus on writing and self-publish. So,
I
yeah.
love it. So tell us a little bit about your series.
Okay. So The Gardener Kings is a trilogy that I started writing it about 10 years ago. So it took me quite a while. And it is a story. It's a fantasy story set in a kind of ancient Celtic setting. It's not exactly historical fiction. It's just kind of Celtic inspired. But it's about a girl who is living in exile on an island. Her father was ousted from the kingdom that he ruled. And then she finds out that he's not actually her father, that she was adopted. And that really throws her for a loop. And she doesn't know anything about where she came from or how we go about finding her. She falls in love with a prince, but she's not allowed to marry him because she doesn't have royal blood. And they decide, well, you know what? Let's go back to the land that you're born from and find your parents, figure out your heritage, and see if there's a possibility that they could get married. And so that begins a journey for her. But when they get there, things are not exactly what they expected. And so that's kind of the launching of a whole journey of self-discovery.
Fantastic. Now, what was your inspiration behind the Celtic inspiration?
That's a great question. I don't know. When I first had the idea, I was an English major and I was reading a lot of fairy tales and I just
Love a
loved
fairy tale.
them.
Yep.
And I was, for whatever reason, especially fascinated by Celtic fairy tales. I read a bunch of like Irish fairy tales and found all these little nuggets of things that I just found really intriguing. And so because that was where I was when I started actually drafting, that was the world I ended up finding myself set in. The original idea I had, I initially pictured more of a like medieval, like classic Arthurian,
Okay.
big
Sure.
castles kind of setting, but ended up finding it more fun to go with something a little bit older and yeah, just a little more exotic maybe.
I love that. Now, because you kind of brought up the fashion, I'm a big fashion person. Tell me a little bit about the fashion in the story. What do we need to know?
Okay, so the Gardener Kings have a magical power over things that grow.
Okay.
So that like really dominates the story. The character dresses herself in flowers a lot.
Oh, my
So
person.
yeah, it's so much fun. So she's constantly like braiding flowers. She puts them in her hair. She wears flower wreaths. And she makes herself necklaces out of flowers. And that's kind of a big part of really her identity. But yeah.
I love that. Okay, so as somebody who loves a good book cosplay, just kind of give us all the details. Is it anything flowers go? Do we specifically have the crowns and the necklaces? Like, what could people do if they want to dress up?
Okay. So, I mean, anything flowers or just planty would go, right? You could do leaves, any of that. I will say roses have a very special place in the story. That is the king's favorite thing to grow. So roses would definitely dominate. There's also a thing called, it's a made up flower called Whin, which is like a white blossom that grows on a vine that will grow over other things. So those feature really prominently, lots of little tiny white delicate flowers.
Beautiful. Okay, I want to get into your characters a little bit. So let's break down your leading lady and let's break down your love interest.
Okay, so the leading lady is Anine, and she starts off as a kind of very insular character. She doesn't have a whole lot of friends. She um, is not super honest even with herself. So she won't admit at first that she's angry at her father for not telling her that she's adopted. She won't admit that she's really freaked out by the fact that she's adopted.
Right.
Um, she has a hard time kind of expressing any of that. And she slowly kind of warms up to being able to articulate herself. So she starts off as a little bit of a passive character, but comes into her own and eventually like very much takes charge of her life and becomes a very strong, strong female character. But it's a little bit of a journey for her to get there.
Okay.
The love interest, his name is Rian, and he also has magical powers over plants, but he does not like growing neat, tiny gardens. Tidy gardens like his father does. He's really into like the wild things. So he moved out to live in the woods because he can't stand living indoors.
Okay.
He climbs trees, he sleeps in trees, and when he grows gardens, they're wild and crazy. So that's kind of his character.
Okay. So kind of like a little opposites attract kind of thing going on, yes?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, I love it. That's fantastic. And this is a trilogy, correct?
that's right.
Beautiful. So we've got the 3 pieces, and in the first book, I want to know who this is the absolute perfect fit for when it comes to readers. If somebody likes certain genres or certain tropes, who's going to be attracted to this first book?
Okay, so I think you're gonna like this book if you like if you like complex characters who have an arc where they change and things are shifting. You're gonna like it if you like characters that are, I guess, questioning themselves and questioning their worldview, and which their concepts of they're willing to change all their concepts, right? If you're willing to kind of shift the way that you view things. And it is a kind of a slow burn romance. It's not the kind of romance where you're gonna like get satisfaction right away. So if you're willing to wait a little while on it, then it's a good book for you. The romance is a relatively small portion of it, so maybe not if you're like a strict romance reader. It's probably not your thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. So that's always a good thing to know jumping into these stories. And I know you said you've been working on this series for a really long time. You started it about 10 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So how long did it take you to actually come up with the entire concept, get it written, and get it ready to go out into the world?
Great question. So it took me about a year to draft the very first draft. And then I sent it to some friends, got some feedback, made some revisions, wrote a second draft, and I tried to send that out to agents and didn't have any success, but I got a little bit of feedback. So I started making some more revisions. And then I had a daughter, and then I went to grad school. And so I kind of just put it aside for a while. But then I came back to it. Gosh, I guess about 3 years ago. And by that point, I had several years to kind of mull it over. And I was like, I think I know what I need to do. I need to make it a trilogy because it originally been one book and it was really just crowded.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I need to expand it, give myself room to really explore some of their internal conflicts and things more. And I completely started over, like I didn't even touch the first draft. And then I wrote, let's see, the first one, I think it took me about a year to write draft 1 of the first book. And then again, sent that out to readers, got feedback, and did another revision. Gosh, I don't know, maybe that took me about 6 months, the revision process.
Okay.
And then this was my very first time in self-publishing, right? So figuring out formatting and copy editing and all of that mess. I think that took me about 6 months. I've now gotten myself like with that, the next 2 books came faster once I kind of got into a swing.
That process, yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And you said that in the middle of working on this story, the very first parts of it over the last couple of years, you paused because you had your baby. Has this impacted how you wrote your story? Did it change anything? Did it influence anything?
Yes. Actually, book 1 is dedicated to my daughter. And the whole concept of daughter is a really big deal in these books, right? Because she's adopted. So she's trying to define, like, am I his daughter or am I my biological parent's daughter? What does it mean to be a daughter?
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that obviously as a daughter, the word daughter meant something to me before. But the whole concept of the connection between a parent and a child definitely transformed when I had my own. So I do think that there is a lot of that in there.
Beautiful. I always love when real life things kind of influence how we're writing, kind of change our storylines and help us to define it a little bit more. Have you implemented anything else from your life, experiences you've had into your story?
That's a great question. I will say that I once dreamed of being a gardener and gardening, and I am terrible at it. I gave up pretty early. I am lucky to trim my bushes once a year and keep them from taking over the house. That's the extent of my landscaping skills.
There you go.
So this is this is kind of the opposite of any real life. I dream of being able to make things grow and the beautiful art that is. But it is not something I have personal experience with. One of my best friends is a gardener, though, so I frequently kept asking her about all of my plant questions, which was wonderful. As far as real life goes, there's a lot of parallels between what happens with the characters' identity crisis, between just my own experience, as an adolescent, kind of working through who am I and how am I going to identify myself. And that journey, I think, is very much reflected from personal experience.
And I think it's a really good thing to point out that you did have to do some research for this book to make sure you were getting things correct. And you had your friend who was an actual gardener to be able to answer those questions. But I want to talk a little bit about your research process and what you did to research for this book. So did you have to do things outside of plant life? And what did that look like for you?
Yeah, so I did a lot of research on the Celts. I really wanted to. If I could have, it would have been better if I could have actually gone to Britain. And I deeply regret that I wasn't able to do that, but it wasn't in the cards. So I did. I watched a great courses series on the ancient Celts. I read a couple books about them. I read some of Julius Caesar's essays on the Celts, which are a little bit hilarious. Yeah, just a little bit of library research on the Celts. I also watched a number of YouTube videos. So there are some great YouTubers who live in Scotland and Ireland who will do like walking tours where they'll hike through the Highlands and talk about what they're seeing. One of them was doing, it was fabulous. I can't remember his name, but he did like a 17th century journey. So he used all the things, wore the clothes that a 17th century Scottish Highlander would have worn. And so you watched his journey, which obviously the 17th century isn't quite the same as the ancient Celts, but you get a little bit more of a sense of like what kinds of things you would do to live off the land. And all of that was just really, really beneficial. I don't know how writers wrote before we had things like YouTube, like
I couldn't even begin to tell you. YouTube and Google, the University of YouTube and Google has been the most prolific thing that I have used inside of my author life. So thank goodness for technology, right?
Absolutely.
So when it comes to doing research for our books and making sure we're writing things properly and making sure we're allowing what's going on in our lives to influence our stories, I want to know what's one thing that surprised you about writing this book?
Ooh, what surprised me? Well, there is one character that completely took me off guard.
I love when characters do that.
Yeah, it's fabulous. He came in, he was supposed to just be a throwaway character that I was like, let me throw a little conflict into here. And then suddenly he was fascinating.
I had one that did that to me.
So he becomes a really big part of the second book. Because I sent it to my beta readers and they were all like, wow, I love that character. And I was like, oh my gosh, me too. I think he needs to be more of a thing. So he became a really big part of the second book, and a significant part of the third book as well. And that was really kind of fun. I was constantly going, gosh, what do I do with this guy? Because he was not part of the plan. And I'm one of those writers who very much like outlines the whole thing. So I keep going, how is this going to affect my outline? But it really is a lot of fun when they take over like that.
Isn't it so interesting? With my story, I had a character who was just supposed to have a couple of lines, and then he forced his way into a bigger scene, and then he forced his way into being a main supporting character, and then he like took over the second book. And for the longest time, I despised him for it, but now I adore him. So I have all the feels with that roller coaster of characters just bullying their way into main character status in our stories.
Absolutely.
I find it to be one of the most interesting things that every once in a while the book can just take over. But I like that you mentioned you're a plotter. You're somebody who likes to know what you're going to write. You take a lot of time and effort to really make sure you have things planned out before you do your writing. So give us one tip for writers who are plotting their stories that might help them out.
So I did some learning in the process while I was writing Gardener Kings. I started when I started outlining and drafting it. When I started outlining it, I had a pretty clear outline of what needed to happen, and I did separate kind of like what events happened, and then what the reader was learning, because there are a number of things that are trying to unfold. So I was trying to make sure that the reader was learning something new in every scene.
Right.
And then while I was doing that, I listened to one of those great courses lectures by, I think his name is Scott Bell, on how to write best-selling fiction. And he has a very particular outline. And when I learned that, I liked his particular outline, but it was not one that I had started with. So I used that outline for books 2 and 3, and I adjusted book 1 a little bit to fit that. But I was kind of already too deep to like completely rearrange it around that. So gosh, this is not a very succinct way of answering your question. I'm sorry.
Oh, good.
But yeah, so outlining, I find it really helpful to have a table that marks not only what is happening, but also what the reader is learning as they're kind of unfolding pieces of the mystery of the character's background and whatnot. But I also find it really helpful, this model that I learned from Scott Bell, which I think he actually got from someone else, but that has you start with, in your first chapter, ideally your first page, like something discomforting. And then you move up to your inciting incident. And then somewhere in the middle, you want to have, right after the inciting incident, you want to have what's called a kick in the pants, like something bad happens. And then there's usually like a whole series of kicks in the pants, like more and more bad things happen.
Yeah.
And then you have some sort of like mirror moment where they're like looking at themselves and reflecting. And then you get to your final stage, which is a second sort of inciting incident that leads you into that final step. And then you end with a transformation of some kind. So that's like a really brief summary of his outline. But I found it really helpful because it makes sure that you're leading through points that are compelling.
That makes a lot of sense. And I love that you pointed out that you keep a running list of what the readers are learning. That's something I haven't heard anybody else talk about. And I've been doing this a long time. So I very much like that you kind of keep that running timeline, but also what they are going to be learning, because then that really helps you to kind of summarize what you've written, know where you're going, and really helps you to move that trajectory of the story forward. So very good tips today. We are coming to the end of our interview. So I need to know, what is one interesting thing that we are going to learn inside of your story?
Let's see. An interesting thing within the story itself?
Yeah, one thing we're going to discover as we're reading.
Oh, okay. Let's see. I think we're going to discover a little bit of what makes a leader a good leader. So the character starts off, sort of assuming, oh, my dad is good. He's a good king, right? And then she starts to question, oh, maybe that's not true. And then she continues to question that for the whole trilogy, like what actually makes someone a good king, and therefore what makes someone a good leader, which I think is relevant to all of us. Like what makes good leadership.
Beautiful. Monica, I am so excited to read your story. If people do want to get their hands on a copy of your book, where are they able to find it?
So on Amazon. You can also look it up at my website, monicaboothe.com.
Beautiful. And where can everybody reach out to you on social media to learn more and to connect?
Okay, I'm on TikTok at Monica Boothe, and you can also join my newsletter also on monicaboothe.com. It's a great way to follow.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate everything. And we will be monitoring your questions and comments down below, everyone. So go ahead and leave it some love down below. We've got Monica's book linked, so make sure you are checking that out as well. And we will see you for our next episode of Author Interviews. Let me know what other authors you would like to see on the show. And if you would like to come join us, if you're a published author, reach out and we will create an interview just for you. Until next time, have a great day and stay inspired.